Imagine a river so dark and slow that the water looks like polished oil. Then imagine the surface bulging because something longer than a city bus is rolling just beneath it. That is the kind of entrance Titanoboa deserves. It was not a fantasy monster invented to scare people around a campfire. It was a real snake, discovered through fossils in northern South America, and it grew to a size that still feels rude to common sense. This animal could stretch well past 40 feet, weigh over a ton, and turn an already dangerous swamp into a place where even crocodile-like predators had to share the water with something bigger than themselves. The reason scientists take Titanoboa so seriously is that its fossils are not vague scraps. Researchers found large vertebrae in the Caraján coal mine in Colombia, and those bones were big enough to redraw the upper limits of snake size. When paleontologists compare vertebrae from living boas and anacondas to these fossil vertebrae, the scaling points to an animal far beyond any snake alive today. That matters because with reptiles, body size is not just a bragging right number. It changes metabolism, hunting range, heat retention, feeding strategy, and the kinds of prey a snake can overpower without wasting precious energy. Here is the first big clue to why Titanoboa became so enormous. Heat. Snakes are ectotherms, which means their environment helps govern how their bodies function. The world Titanoboa lived in was a greenhouse world, hotter and wetter than the modern tropics, with dense rainforest, broad river channels, and air heavy enough to feel like a second skin. In that kind of climate, a giant snake could stay active, digest huge meals, and keep enough body temperature to make an immense body practical instead of disastrous. Titanoboa was not giant in spite of its environment. It was giant because the environment made giant possible. Now comes the first real rehook, because Titanoboa was not simply an anaconda scaled up like a toy model. Its body proportions suggest a massively built snake, one with deep, heavy muscle and a torso designed for pushing against water and prey with frightening leverage. That changes how you should picture it. This was not a quick, whip-like serpent flickering across dry ground. It was closer to a living hydraulic cable, dense, deliberate, and devastating once contact was made. In water, where buoyancy helps support that weight, Titanoboa would have been even more dangerous because its mass stopped being a handicap and became pure force. So, how did something like this hunt? The safest answer is that Titanoboa lived the way giant constrictors live now, but on a scale large enough to push that strategy into another category. It likely used water, cover, and patience. A giant body hidden in a channel or along a flooded bank does not need speed if the strike distance is short and the target is already within reach. Once a prey animal was seized, the battle was not about venom. It was about grip, pressure, and timing. A constrictor does not have to crush every bone. It only has to stop effective breathing and circulation long enough for panic to become weakness. That brings us to one of the most important facts about Titanoboa. Its power came from constriction, and constriction is more sophisticated than people often imagine. A large snake does not just squeeze randomly. It tightens in response to each breath and each movement of the prey, making every escape attempt cost more oxygen and more energy. On a 1-ton snake, that feedback loop becomes nightmarish. Large fish, crocodiliforms, and other swamp animals would have faced an attacker that could anchor itself, coil, and turn the prey's own struggling into the mechanism of its collapse. Titanoboa won by making resistance biologically expensive. The second major rehook is ecological. Titanoboa did not live alone in a cartoon swamp built around its ego. It shared its world with giant turtles, huge fish, crocodiliform predators, and a rainforest so productive it could feed large animals at many levels of the food web. That matters because a predator this large needs an ecosystem with enough biomass to support repeated large meals. The Sarajevo environment appears to have been exactly that kind of place. A lush hot system where energy moved through water and vegetation at a pace modern cooler environments often cannot match. Titanoboa was not a glitch. It was a top consumer in a very rich machine. And that raises the next premium question. If Titanoboa became possible because the world was hotter, what happened when the world refused to stay that way? Very large ectotherms live near an environmental bargain. They gain enormous size when temperature and habitat cooperate, but that size can become a burden when climates cool, wetlands shrink, or prey communities reorganize. Titanoboa's disappearance was not likely one dramatic instant. It was probably a slow ecological eviction, where the combination of changing heat, changing habitats, and changing food webs made a giant constrictor less and less viable. The same conditions that built the monster eventually withdrew their support. There is also a myth worth killing cleanly. Titanoboa was not a dinosaur-era sea monster, and it was not some direct secret ancestor waiting to be rediscovered in a modern jungle. It lived after the non-avian dinosaurs were gone in the Paleocene, and the evidence for it is geological, specific, and finite. That precision is what makes the animal so compelling. We are not dealing with folklore inflated by rumor. We are dealing with a measurable giant whose vertebrae, environment, and biology all line up into a sober reconstruction. The truth is better than the myth, because the truth tells us exactly what kind of world can build a snake this extreme. One of the strongest scientific payoffs in the Titanoboa story is that it lets paleontologists test how climate constrains body size. A snake this big acts like a natural experiment preserved in rock. If you know how large it was, and you know roughly how ectotherms function, you can infer something about the minimum heat and humidity that had to exist for such an animal to thrive. That makes Titanoboa more than a spectacular reptile. It becomes a climate proxy with teeth. Its body is evidence, not just anatomy, and that means every coil points beyond the snake itself to the atmosphere, rainfall, and swamp temperatures of a vanished Earth. By the time you put all the pieces together, Titanoboa stops being just the biggest snake headline and becomes a complete ecological story. A greenhouse world created warm, saturated wetlands. Those wetlands supported rich prey webs. Rich prey webs could sustain giant constrictors, and giant constrictors, once established, became defining predators in their habitat. Then the system changed, and the upper limit changed with it. That arc matters today because it shows how tightly body size, climate, and food availability are braided together. No giant animal exists alone. Every giant is a summary of the environment that permits it to keep existing. Titanoboa is unforgettable because it combines three things at once: a body size that feels impossible, a hunting method that requires no venom to be terrifying, and a climate story that explains why the impossible briefly became normal. Its fossils tell us that if Earth becomes hot and wet enough, some lineages do not simply survive. They expand into dimensions that modern ecosystems no longer allow. That is the lasting power of Titanoboa. It is not just a giant snake from the past. It is a warning about how radically different life can become when the planet changes the rules. What prehistoric predator would you most want to see reconstructed with this level of realism next?